There is rarely an announcement when explaining oneself begins to feel unnecessary. No argument, no final conversation, no clear decision. It arrives quietly. In the space between words that once came easily and now feel heavy, a pause stretches, longer than expected. A sentence is formed, then released before being spoken. This is not indifference. It is recognition. For a long time, explaining felt like a bridge, a way to remain connected, understood, and safe. Every clarification was an offering, every justification a small hope that being seen would prevent distance. To explain was to soften misunderstandings before they could harden into rejection. But something shifts when explanations stop working. The same stories are repeated, the same intentions clarified, the same emotions translated into simpler language, again and again. And still, misunderstanding remains, not because the words were unclear, but because the listening was never present. In this moment, silence begins to feel different. It is no longer empty. It is observant. There is an awareness that some people are not confused, they are simply not aligned. No amount of explanation can create emotional readiness where it does not exist. No careful phrasing can make someone care in the way they never learned to. This realization does not feel empowering at first. It feels like loss, the loss of effort, the loss of hope, the loss of the belief that being clearer will finally lead to being chosen. And so the voice softens, not in anger, not in pride, but in fatigue. Explaining requires faith, faith that words will be held with care. When that faith erodes, silence becomes a form of self-protection, not a wall, but a boundary that asks for less performance and more truth. In this early stage, silence feels unfamiliar, almost wrong. There is a lingering impulse to correct misunderstandings before they form, to justify emotions before they are questioned, to translate oneself before being misread. Yet something steadier begins to form beneath the discomfort, a quiet knowing. The realization that being understood is not always something that can be earned through effort. Sometimes it is something that can only be offered freely, or not at all. And in that recognition, the transformation begins. Silence stops being a retreat. It becomes the first honest response. Before silence, there was a need, not a shallow one, a human one. The need to be understood often forms long before language becomes precise. In early moments of development, understanding meant safety. It meant emotional attunement, predictability, and care. To be misunderstood was not simply frustrating, it felt destabilizing. For some, explaining became a way to stabilize relationships, a way to reduce tension before it could grow, a way to stay connected by anticipating confusion and smoothing it away with words. This habit rarely announces itself as insecurity. It often looks like thoughtfulness, clarity, emotional intelligence, but beneath it lives a quiet belief: if they understand me, I will be safe. In childhood environments where emotions were misread, minimized, or ignored, self-explanation becomes adaptive. Feelings are translated into acceptable language. Needs are softened so they don't overwhelm others. Intentions are clarified in advance to avoid being judged unfairly. Over time, this turns into a pattern. The mind learns to narrate itself continuously, not to manipulate, but to prevent rupture, not to seek control, but to maintain connection. Explaining becomes a form of emotional labor performed silently and constantly. It happens in conversations, in text messages, in internal rehearsals before speaking at all. There is a vigilance to it, a scanning for misunderstanding before it occurs. And when understanding finally arrives, it feels like relief. Brief, fragile, conditional, because the relief depends on another person's perception. The tragedy of this pattern is not that it comes from weakness. It comes from adaptation, a system shaped by the belief that connection requires constant clarification, that presence must be justified, that being oneself is not enough without explanation. As this pattern matures, it quietly teaches a person to abandon parts of their internal experience. Emotions are filtered, instincts are questioned, silences are felt even when they feel true. By the time explaining becomes exhausting, it has already done its work. It has kept relationships intact. It has avoided conflict. It has preserved belonging, at least on the surface. But it has also delayed something essential: the realization that being understood is not the same as being accepted. And that explaining can sometimes prevent the deeper truth from ever being revealed. From a psychological perspective, the impulse to explain is not random. It is structured, learned, reinforced over time. The brain is designed to seek coherence, both internally and socially, when misunderstandings threaten connection. The nervous system responds with urgency. Words become a tool to restore equilibrium. In attachment theory, this pattern is often linked to anxious or preoccupied attachment styles. Connection feels uncertain. Emotional availability feels inconsistent. Explaining becomes a way to secure closeness by reducing ambiguity. The mind learns an equation early on. Clarity equals safety. Over-explaining is not about talking too much. It is about anticipating loss. Cognitive psychology describes this as hypermentalizing and over-attunement to how one is perceived. Attention turns outward. Energy is spent predicting reactions, correcting interpretations, and managing impressions. This outward focus creates a subtle disconnection from the self. Feelings are monitored instead of felt. Instincts are questioned before they are trusted. Neuroscience adds another layer. When understanding is achieved, the brain releases small amounts of relief-based neurotransmitters. Validation calms the nervous system. For a moment, tension subsides. But the relief is temporary because it depends on repetition. Each new interaction restarts the cycle. Each potential misunderstanding triggers the same internal response: explain, clarify, reassure. Over time, this becomes neurologically efficient. The brain prefers familiar pathways, even if they are exhausting. Explaining turns into an automatic response rather than a conscious choice. There is also an identity component. Explaining helps maintain a consistent self-image by narrating intentions. A person reinforces who they believe themselves to be: kind, reasonable, safe. Silence threatens that structure. Without explanation, the mind fears being misread, and being misread feels like losing control over one's story. Yet psychologically, something else is happening beneath the fear. When explanations stop, the brain is forced to tolerate uncertainty. It can no longer manage perception through language. It must sit with the discomfort of not being fully known. This is where the transformation quietly accelerates. Not because the mind wants silence, but because it is slowly learning that safety does not always come from being understood. Sometimes it comes from self-containment. When explanations fade, something unsettled rises to the surface. Not peace, not clarity, but tension. Silence creates space, and in that space, the mind begins to protest. There is guilt, the feeling of withholding, as if not explaining is an act of emotional negligence. A fear that quiet will be interpreted as coldness, distance, or indifference. There is also anxiety. Without explanation, misinterpretation becomes possible. Stories can form without correction. Intentions can be misunderstood and never clarified. For a mind trained to manage connection, this feels dangerous. The urge returns quickly. To add context, to soften statements, to preemptively defend feelings before they are challenged. Silence feels like abandoning a responsibility that was never formally assigned, but deeply internalized. This is the inner conflict. One part of the self longs for rest, the other fears loss. The part that longs for rest knows the cost of constant narration, the emotional fatigue, the slow erosion of authenticity. The quiet resentment that builds when energy is spent explaining to those who are not truly listening. The part that fears loss remembers moments when being misunderstood led to rejection, distance, withdrawal, emotional consequences that felt irreversible. These parts speak at the same time. Rest feels like risk, silence feels like exposure, and so the nervous system wavers between relief and alarm. Moments of quiet are followed by second-guessing. Text messages are reread. Unsaid explanations gather weight in the mind. This conflict is not a failure of growth. It is a sign of transition. The psyche is recalibrating. Old strategies are losing effectiveness. New ones have not yet stabilized. What makes this phase difficult is its invisibility. From the outside, nothing has changed. Life continues. Conversations happen. But internally, something fundamental is being renegotiated. The belief that connection requires constant justification. The assumption that misunderstanding must always be corrected. The fear that being misread is intolerable. Silence challenges these beliefs not with certainty, but with presence. Each moment of restraint becomes an experiment. Each withheld explanation a test of emotional survival. And slowly, without force, The system begins to learn something unexpected. Not every misunderstanding leads to loss. Not every silence breaks connection. Some relationships remain, some deepen, some dissolve. And in that sorting, a quieter truth begins to surface, one that does not need to be explained to exist. The realization does not arrive as insight. It arrives as relief, not sudden, not complete, but unmistakable. There is a moment, often small, when silence no longer feels like absence. A conversation ends without clarification. A message goes unanswered. An explanation is left unsent. And nothing collapses. The feared consequences do not arrive in the way the mind predicted. Connection does not always dissolve. Identity does not disappear. The self remains intact. This is where the inner narrative begins to change. Understanding, it becomes clear, was never guaranteed by explanation. Some people understood without effort. Others never did, no matter how carefully words were chosen. The difference was not clarity, it was capacity. This recognition reframes the past. It becomes apparent that many explanations were not invitations to be known, but attempts to manage outcomes, to preserve harmony, to avoid being misjudged, to keep emotional ground from shifting beneath one's feet. But harmony achieved through self-erasure is not stability, it is tension delayed. The quiet realization is not that explaining was wrong. It was necessary, once. It served a purpose. It protected connection when other resources were unavailable. What changes is the understanding that the purpose has expired. Silence no longer signals danger. It signals choice. The self begins to notice how differently people respond. Some lean in, curious and attentive. Others drift, uncomfortable without guidance or reassurance. This contrast becomes informative. It reveals which connections were built on mutual presence and which depended on constant interpretation. Which relationships could hold ambiguity, and which required control. There is grief here, not for what is lost, but for what was hoped for. The hope that being clear enough would finally create understanding. The hope that effort could compensate for emotional absence. Letting go of that hope hurts, but it also releases a burden. The need to be seen transforms into a willingness to be as one is, even if misunderstood, not as defiance, as truth. In this phase, silence becomes less about restraint and more about alignment. Words are used when they feel honest, withheld when they feel performative, and in that discernment, something steadier begins to form, a sense of self that does not need constant narration to exist. Asterisk, as silence integrates, it stops feeling like a decision. It becomes a state. There is less urgency in the body. The nervous system no longer scans every interaction for signs of misunderstanding. Energy that once moved outward begins to settle inward. This is not withdrawal. It is grounding. Without constant explanation, boundaries begin to form naturally, not through rules or declarations, but through rhythm. What is shared feels intentional. What is withheld feels protective rather than avoidant. The self becomes less fragmented. Thoughts no longer rush ahead to justify feelings. Emotions are allowed to exist without translation. Presence replaces performance. Psychologically, this marks a shift from external regulation to internal regulation. Safety is no longer negotiated through language. It is generated through self-trust. The mind begins to tolerate being misread, not because misunderstanding feels good, but because it no longer feels catastrophic. Identity stabilizes when it is no longer dependent on constant clarification. This stability changes how relationships are experienced. Interactions become quieter, but more precise. Words carry weight because they are no longer excessive. Silence becomes a shared space rather than a defensive one. Some connections deepen in this environment. They respond to presence, not explanation. Others fade, unable to exist without constant reassurance or interpretation. This is not rejection, it is differentiation. The emotional system learns that not every connection is meant to be maintained through effort. Some are meant to dissolve when the work stops. There is grief in this, but also relief. The self no longer feels responsible for managing how it is perceived. Responsibility returns to where it belongs, with the listener. Over time, a subtle confidence emerges, not loud, not assertive, quiet. The confidence of someone who no longer rushes to explain their worth, who trusts that what is true will remain, even without elaboration. This is integration. The parts that once explained for safety now rest. The parts that feared silence learn that stillness can hold connection. And what remains is not emptiness, but a grounded sense of being that does not require translation to be real. There is a subtle beauty in the state of being unexplained. A quiet dignity emerges when words are no longer used to secure connection. It is not arrogance, it is presence. Living unexplained does not mean detachment, it means allowance. A willingness to exist without constant validation, without rehearsed justification, without performing understanding for others. In this space, emotions are held, not projected. Thoughts are expressed selectively, not compulsively. Silence becomes a companion, not a void. It carries meaning in itself, a language that is not spoken but deeply felt. Relationships transform. Some soften into deeper intimacy. Curiosity replaces expectation. Listening becomes mutual rather than performative. Others drift, and their absence is neither shocking nor painful. It is simply a reflection of misalignment, of energy that was never fully compatible. The internal narrative changes. Being unexplained fosters self-containment. Identity no longer depends on perception. Approval is no longer sought, because the self has already accounted for its own truth. Existence is affirmed quietly, in stillness. There is also freedom here, freedom from rehearsing, from correcting, from anticipating judgment, freedom to feel fully, to think fully, to be fully, without constant translation. It is a slow liberation, almost imperceptible, yet transformative. And finally, there is compassion. For those who could not understand, for the moments when explanations were necessary, for the self that once feared silence. Being unexplained is not rejection, it is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of limits, of boundaries, of the delicate ecology of human connection. The world continues, as it always does, but now it is witnessed differently. One does not disappear when left unexplained. One is simply more present, more authentic, more complete. In the stillness of this state, the transformation is fully visible, not dramatic, not loud, but profound. The silent transformation that began when explanation stopped has matured. It has shaped identity. It has redefined connection. It has created space for a self that is whole, even when unobserved. And in this quiet, the truth is revealed. Sometimes, the most radical act of honesty is simply to exist without explanation.